Yeah, I guess, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne, for inviting us over. So Reda is here. I'm going to start the presentation. And, well, Reda is going to talk about the hard part, so I'm going to talk about the easy part. So it's really exciting to be here in Estonia, actually my first time. And thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. So what we want to do today, actually, is, well, maybe take a bird's eye view and kind of go back in time and think about how do countries really grow over time, and what are kind of key policies that let them grow and kind of innovate. And we talk about basically the whole full spectrum, going from the beginning, low income, middle income, all the way to the top, to the advanced countries. And once you get there, of course, the key question is, how do you stay there, rather than you kind of falling through time? So that's basically what we want to talk about. And this is a quote from Lee Kuan Yew, the late founder of Singapore. And if you look at this, well, he's not talking about we need a private sector, we need efficient private sector, we need anything of this sort. He talks about smart government, really. So, and he says, if you have a dumb government, well, we probably will sink into nothingness. So it's important to talk about the role of the state. So if you look at this chart, it's basically about real GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms from 1950s all the way to 2014 for four major economies: Korea, Chile, Malaysia, and Ghana. And you can see in the 50s, 60s, Korea was below all of them, right, for quite some time. And it overtook all of them one by one, and now it's one of the richest countries in the world today. Within 1 or 2 generations, they did something that many countries could not do. So the key question is, what did they do that others could emulate? You can see Malaysia and Chile, which is in black and blue lines. They did something right, but not exactly the same. And of course, Ghana and many other countries didn't improve much over time. And this plot is basically looks at GDP per capita relative to the US in 1970 versus 2014 on the y-axis. So you can see these lines, the 50% of US GDP per capita, that's how we define advanced country status. 20% of US GDP per capita is basically upper middle income. So you can see many countries who started in the 70s in the upper corner over there, advanced countries, they stay advanced. Many in the middle, they stay upper middle. Many low middle income countries stay there. Few make it to middle income. You can see, for example, Poland, Hungary, you can see Malta, Romania, and others, but very few jump to advanced country status. And if you look at the advanced country status countries who made it from low and low middle, or middle, it's Korea, Taiwan province of China, Oman, Aruba, Hong Kong, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Japan, Italy, Israel, Equatorial Guinea. And there are a few others. Estonia, the way we define the 50 percentile, 50% of US GDP per capita actually falls into that category. It's just we don't have data in 1970, so it doesn't show up. But Estonia just crossed that 50% of US GDP per capita. So according to our classification, it will be considered advanced country. But it still has a lot to catch up, right? It's 50% of US GDP per capita. And if you look at these countries, there are 15 out of 182 countries in the sample that we have who made it to that level. Most of them are either close to the Western Europe, so we had a lot of convergence. The European Union, definitely it helped. Few oil exporters. You have Dutch island, Aruba, and the rest are Asian miracles. It's Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So the question is, what can we learn, especially from those, to see if we can improve upon what others can do? And many would argue that Asian miracles are just random events. Well, this Nobel laureate in physics says, well, it's not really about averages. It's all about the extremes, right? And that's what we try to figure out. There is information in these extremes that we can learn from. So as economists, this innovation growth, this is not new. It goes back to 1950s, Bob Solow, the whole importance of productivity gains. And in terms of innovation, well, this literature also started in the late 80s, early 90s. There is this innovation-led growth. And the key point is there that you want to have this sustained productivity gains to keep growing over time, from low income, middle income, upper income, and so on. And important point here is that you want to switch from investment-based strategy to innovation-based strategy. Of course, the question is, what is that certain level of development when you switch, right? It's not that clear cut. But what is clear is you want to keep introducing the new goods and tasks, right? And keep moving up the quality ladder. And to do that, for example, Lucas argued in his paper, you have to be a large exporter, right? So this is the theory, that's what we learned from theory, and there is a lot of literature coming since then, trying to dig deeper into this. Empirically, this whole literature on growth regressions, and one key element that stands out is export sophistication, how sophisticated your exports are, which is in a way a proxy for the tradable production, how sophisticated are the goods that the country produces. And that's actually quite important too, and that's what we'll argue later on. Now, if you think this is what we learn from theory and empirics, well, then the advice is, well, the usual advice we always hear, right? Let's improve the business environment, macro stability, reduce regulations, and things will happen on their own. No, the firms will spring out of nowhere, and they'll grow to become big firms, and they'll bring the country with them. Well, we argue based on the example of the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and so on. In this book that we did a year ago, Breaking the Oil Spill, we argue that that's not sufficient. And these countries are a good example, especially if you look at Emirates. All these conditions that you think of, no taxes, no regulations, you can bring any skills you want, are there. But they don't produce tradable goods, especially sophisticated tradable goods. And actually, their relative productivity gains are actually been negative over time. So they have been sliding down the relative income rankings. For example, Kuwait used to be 5 times US GDP per capita in the 70s. It's the same now as the US GDP per capita. So these things basically talk about what we call government failures. And these issues usually tackle government failures. They don't tackle what we talk about as market failures. And you can see some of this on this graph, competitiveness index, doing business indicator. Most of these countries are there in the corner, close to Singapore, right? Market failures, that's basically important element. You have all these important indicators, but we don't find firms going into tradable sectors. We don't find firms going into important, sophisticated production. And why that is the case? Well, it's about externalities, learning by doing, risk. Why would you want to go into this risky enterprise when you can make money doing real estate, construction, retail, or other non-tradables, or very simple stuff? And the market failures basically necessitate simply the intervention by the state. You need to have the role of the state, what we call the leading hand of the state, to create this dynamic export sector. And this dynamic export sector is really the key, we argue, that will kind of grow the economy forward and kind of keep it there, right? So these are some key elements about the creation of the dynamic export sector, right? So if you look at history and you look at Asian miracles, the key important element that these guys did that other countries did not was export-oriented policies rather than import substitution. And that's where many countries in Latin America, Middle East failed. You talk about industrial policies of the past, they failed, we argue, because of import substitution policies, right? It's really about export orientation. Second important element about building domestic capabilities versus kind of what we call portfolio diversification, or basically getting into other industries by importing technology and so on. This is very key, and Reda is going to go into more detail on this part. But interesting example here is Norway in the 70s, when they actually developed their oil services cluster. So it may seem that came out of nowhere, but was very state-driven intervention. They would even intervene in the contracts, procurement, to make sure Norwegian firms were doing R&D with foreigners in the development of the oil services cluster. And now it's pretty big oil cluster. Didn't happen in many other oil exporters. They went into petrochems, metals, mostly imported technology, but nothing else. Third important element, sophistication, sophisticated tradable goods versus the usual thing we hear, agriculture, services, tourism, finance. Everyone wants to be a logistic hub, touristic hub, financial hub. Well, that's fine, but that's not really where the state should be kind of intervening. You provide this enabling environment, well, let the private sector take care of it. The private sector won't go into sophisticated exports, sophisticated production, sophisticated manufacturing. The risks are way too high, right? And that's where you get the productivity gains that you wouldn't get in other sectors, right? So this is an important point. And the last point is, well, there's a whole literature on competitive advantage. You do what you do best. You start improving upon what you have, little by little, and eventually you'll get there. May work in some countries, but it will take a whole lot of time to get to the advanced country status. Chile is a good example. They basically follow their competitive advantage strategies. And we saw Chile has done relatively well. It's a poster child of minimum state intervention, creation of macro stability, and so on. But it still wasn't as successful as Korea. And it was pretty much in agribusiness. And of course, copper is their other major export. Malaysia did venture beyond competitive advantage, but they weren't as forceful and successful as Korea, and we'll mention why that is the case shortly. So these are two ways to think about which sectors to go to, and we argue to really get all the way to the top, you gotta go beyond the competitive advantage sectors. Right? So different ways you can think about how the state could support these type of initiatives. Of course, direct, indirect, right? And could be creation of domestic firms, spin-offs, starting from scratch, R&D type of approach. Electronics in Taiwan province of China is a good example. You'll hear more on that from Reda shortly. He'll talk about the case on that. Indirect, of course, you can support through different types of agencies, right? In Singapore, they have this Biopolis, creation of biotech cluster. The state was pretty involved, trying to bring FDI, grow domestic firms. SBIR in the US, which is a program to provide loans to high-tech companies. Apple, Google, they all benefited from it. Of course, the US has a huge number of programs to support tech companies. BNDES, Brazilian Development Bank, they were pretty successful in ethanol, in pharma, software to some extent. So they did support a lot of companies to help them export and grow. But the key element in doing so is the market discipline. So you want to have accountability. So support has to be provided such that there is accountability. And one way to measure accountability is, well, exports. It's much easier to measure, and then you can see how firms grow, do they get market share, and it also provides fierce competition. So if you are a small open economy like Estonia, you have no choice but to export, especially for small open economies. So one interesting example I want to bring up is on the case of automotive sector in Malaysia versus Korea. And this is a classic example of import protection policies in Malaysia. They still have the car industry, right? And export orientation policies of Korea. So Hyundai was pretty successful, but when they started, of course, who would buy Korean cars in the 80s? No, they were pretty bad cars, right? But they did improve substantially, and their goal was you move first, and then you start exporting, right? You move first, export, learn, adjust. So exports were there from the outset. In Malaysia, wasn't the case, right? They tried at some point, but then it didn't work out at the end because they were protected domestically, and they were making money, and they didn't really care. So strict accountability was an important part. Hyundai used to be a construction company and became a conglomerate of many other things, right? So they did spend a lot on R&D, and they start producing their engine much early on. Malaysia still imports engines from Mitsubishi, right? They never produce their own engine. And of course, competition, not just on international markets, domestically as well. Korea is a relatively bigger country, so they had all these different conglomerates or chaebols, and they were competing with each other as well. Right? So some of the key elements that we believe made Korea successful that Malaysia was not good at and could not really make it. So the question is then, well, Malaysia did try to do something that other countries did not. They ventured into electronics. They went beyond their competitive advantage. They did provide all this business environment, skills, and other things that we usually talk about, kind of standard growth policy advice. But it still didn't get all the way to the top. So the question is, what's going on, right? And this divergence is kind of instructive because what we try to argue is that the difference is really about innovation policies, right? So going from middle to the top is about innovation. And this is basically real GDP per capita, Malaysia, Korea, and Taiwan province of China. You can see Taiwan province of China overtook Malaysia in the 60s, and Korea overtook Malaysia in the 80s. And then they just kept growing. Malaysia also grew, so it's not a basket case. They did grow well, but not enough, not high enough. And if you look at TFP, total factor productivity, is basically the efficiency of the use of the inputs plus whatever else is left over once you account for capital, labor, human capital accumulation. So once you get rid of the inputs in the output, you end up with what is known as total factor productivity. And you can see the black line, Malaysia, not much growth. And if we believe the theory, economic theory, that's really about productivity gains, we don't really see much here, right? Korea and Taiwan, these economies, they grew over time. So no wonder they had higher growth rates. So the question is, why stagnant productivity growth in Malaysia? We talked about sophisticated exports. Malaysia did improve a lot. So how come? Well, if you kind of dig deeper, you will see that most of this sophistication in exports coming from FDI, multinational corporations, right? So they did invite a lot of that. They did improve their exports, electronics and so on, but not sufficient enough, right? You can see Chile, they didn't improve much in their export sophistication, and I mentioned it's mostly about agribusiness. And really here is the key graph that we argue that Malaysia hasn't succeeded as well as it could have, and compared to Korea and Taiwan especially. You look patents per million people filed in the, granted in the US. So this is the US PTO, Patent Trademark Office. You can see huge increase in the patents per million people in Korea and Taiwan, and barely noticeable amount in Malaysia and Chile, right? So the argument is, to really get all the way to the top, you gotta create your own technology. Domestic firms have to create their own technology, right? And that's key driver that kind of allows you or lets you get all the way to advanced country status, right? So I'm not, now the tough part of the presentation comes. I'm gonna give it to Reda, and he'll give you interesting stories about some of the details. So here you go, thank you.
All right, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing this event. I just want to mention you are not so late, and any excuse to escape the building is a good excuse, so thanks. So we'll just keep on the same slides, right? It's coming up. Yes, exactly, same presentation at the same slide, please. All right, it's okay. All right. Okay, so as Fuad mentioned, really what you see is the divergence, right, around the 80s between Malaysia, Taiwan province, between Korea, Taiwan province of China on one hand, and then Malaysia and Chile on the other hand. So huge increase in the number of patents per million people granted in the US. So you can see that they were much more innovative. Now, if we look at in terms of inputs, right? So the typical input you study when you want to think about innovation is, of course, spending on research and development as a share of GDP. So here we have Malaysia and Thailand on one hand, and then Korea on the other hand. What you really want to compare is basically the gray bar here, which is Malaysia's spending on R&D in 2011, compared to the white bar here, which is Korea's spending on R&D in '96, where basically Korea's GDP per capita was relatively closer to Malaysia. And you can see that Korea was spending already more than twice compared to Malaysia in terms of R&D. So huge effort. And this is even more impressive compared to Thailand. Now, if we kind of zoom out and try to compare Korea, which grew very fast and overtook many countries on its way, if you want, to the top, what happened in terms of innovation? So the way to read this graph, basically the red curve is the number of, or the logarithm of the number of patents per million granted in the US for Korean firms, right? So this is Korea basically in red. And then whenever you see a label in blue, that's pretty much that it means that basically, for example, for Brazil, it means that Korea overtook Brazil in '81 in terms of GDP per capita, or they reached the same level. And the position of the blue label tells you basically the number of patents in Brazil per million. So what you can see is that starting in the '70s, when Korea was basically following a heavy industrialization policy, well, they had pretty much the same number of patents as Philippines, then Tunisia when they overtook them, close to Brazil. But then when they overtake Chile, they have much more patents. Malaysia, which is our case, also much more patents. Mexico, same thing. Portugal, Greece, Slovenia. I mean, here you have two, exceptions, which are South Africa and Hungary. But the important point is that later on, so in 2014, we re-report the number of patents in each one of these countries. And you can see that while Korea grew tremendously over these 2-3 decades, Hungary actually increased much less, right? Actually, South Africa even stagnated, right? So what you can see is that whenever they overtook a country, they were actually innovating much more than them. To give you an idea of the magnitudes, because the graph was in log, you can see that, for example, when Korea overtook, for example, Greece, Greece had a number of patents granted per year in the teens. Korea was already close to 30. New Zealand, same thing. Korea close to 100. Spain, same thing in the teens. Korea now is more than 200. In 2014, actually, Korean firms are granted more than 300 patents per million per year, right? Huge differences, including with advanced economies. So huge effort in terms of innovation. Why this graph is important? Because we consider GDP per capita as a good proxy for many of the variables of policy, right? Business environment, you name it, right? So that means that basically when Korea had comparable GDP per capita or comparable environment to these countries, they were actually producing much more effort in terms of innovation, right? At least in terms of result. This graph is just a little different. So instead of looking at the year where they overtook them, we look at basically the year where Korea had the same GDP per capita as Slovenia today. So pretty much the same idea. So in terms of R&D spending as a percent of GDP, we see kind of the same pattern. So Korea was producing much more effort in R&D compared to Estonia, for example, in 2001, compared to Portugal, compared to Italy, compared to Spain, even compared to Japan, right? So they had much more patents, but they were investing much more in R&D as a share of GDP. This is the same graph reporting the number of people in research, the number of workers. You can see this time that the picture is not as clear. So that means that it's really about the money, not about the number of people, at least, as a first analysis. Now, so let me go back to the case of Malaysia. As Fuad mentioned, Malaysia did a lot of things correctly or right. They actually had a lot of similarities with Korea and Taiwan province of China. One of these similarities is that Malaysia invested a lot in electronics. They invested a lot in inviting multinationals in electronics. But the issue is that they were not as successful as Taiwan province in China in terms of producing this electronic. Does not mean that the Malaysians were not aware of that. They really tried hard to kind of, policies of sticks and carrots with the multinationals to kind of entice them to do more R&D and more innovation and more spillovers with their own economy. But it didn't work as well. They had a vendor development program for local suppliers, but not enough local companies were even, how to say, could not even fill the requirements for this program. So in the end, not much innovation and not much spillovers to the local economy. So when we think about Taiwan province of China, most people think of it as electronics. That's true. So same strategy at around the same time, 70s and 80s. Also, most people think of it as kind of the paradise of venture capital, the links with Silicon Valley, which is true to a larger extent. But when we studied, if you want, the genesis of this sector, we were surprised to discover that pretty much state policies were there active at every turn of the creation of these firms. So what they did is that they created a sort of system to churn out small and medium enterprises in electronic that grew very fast. The way they did it, pretty much they had an umbrella organization that drove the whole, if you want, system, which was called ITRI. This umbrella, if you want, agency thought about all the elements that were necessary to grow this sector, to develop it. They had their own public research institute, which would send civil servants to the US. They would buy a license for an American company, learn the technology. They would come back as a team, work in this public research institute that was called ERSO. They would start trying, tinker around, produce, and then this same group would actually be spun off, right? So they would create a spin-off. Exactly, with these people who were civil servants, overnight, they would become basically a startup, right? And would help them grow. So the first spin-off company was called UMC. The head of this startup company was the deputy director of this public research institute. And this company is today 20% of the semiconductor market, global market. The second spin-off is TSMC. It took about 6 years later. In terms of amount, it was about $200 million, right, seed money. The second company is today 50% of the semiconductor market. So with relatively little money, these companies became huge players. The second point also about this strategy is that they were extremely ambitious. So in the 80s, Taiwan's province of China was a relatively poor country, right? They just overtook Malaysia. And yet, when they kind of produced these spin-offs, they actually jumped right to the frontier. They actually innovated even in terms of process, in terms of production. So basically, this is for the model of Taiwan. The interesting thing is that this system of spin-off was stopped in 94, 95, right? At the request of the UMC and TSMC and the other firms, right? So basically, enough competition, I guess. Now, when we talk about R&D, it would be interesting to think about who actually does R&D in countries. So this spider web, if you want, comes from the OECD website. And what you see in blue is basically the median country in the OECD, right? And what you see is the distribution of R&D along different dimensions. So how much of the R&D is in industry, how much of it is done in high tech, how much by foreign affiliates, and so on and so forth. So the blue is the median OECD. The red one is actually Estonia, right? And the dashed line is Finland, right? So we know Finland actually produces more, patents, right? Is also at a higher level of GDP per capita. So the striking thing is that compared to Estonia, most of the R&D in Finland is in industry. Most of it is in high tech. Most of it is done by large firms. Nokia plays a huge role here. And most of it is done by domestic firms against Nokia. Compared to Estonia, most of the R&D is actually in services, right? These two dimensions, and most of it is done in SMEs. And if you run this kind of distribution over the countries that are successful in innovation, you'd see the same pattern as Finland, mostly done by domestic firms, large firms in high tech and in industry, right? So that's, and the other important point is that most of the R&D in these countries is done by the private sector. So it's kind of surprising. So we're talking about the role of the state, but most of the R&D is done by these private firms. So what we need to understand is the flip side of the question is not how to increase not only the R&D share of the public sector, but how to create the firms in the correct sectors, right? If most of your firms are in service sectors, Well, it's kind of natural that they don't do much R&D. If you look at the R&D intensity in the US per sector, you would discover that there is a huge variance. For example, R&D in pharmaceuticals is 15 times what it is in services. Same thing for electronics, right? So if you have most of your economic activity in services, excluding software, of course, well, it's natural that these firms do not do much R&D. So really, it comes back to the point that was made by Fuad earlier. It's really about specializing, producing, and exporting complicated goods, right? That would lead to higher R&D and innovation. By nature, these sectors are extremely competitive. For example, electronics, you have to do a lot of R&D. So the real question is, how do you get into these sectors when you're not acting in these sectors? And we'll claim that you need to venture into these sectors, and we'll talk about a few examples of countries and how they did it. So, in terms of the kind of sketch of the policies, the first important feature of kind of policies that would lead to that is purpose-specific policies. What we mean by that is this is in opposition to general policies, right? So you can think about building a highway, having a good framework, and so on and so forth. Not to say that these things are not necessary, but what we mean is that the countries that were extremely innovative and successful in creating firms, domestic firms in high tech, they really thought about one activity or one sector. And they thought about all the binding constraints. What is the infrastructure I need? What are the skills? What is the legal framework I need? They also thought about the funding. We also talk about the university-centered innovation. Basically, how do you create ideas, right? Mostly using applied science universities. And also they thought about clusterization, agglomeration. It's very important to have a critical mass of entrepreneur and skills in this sector, right? If you have a lot of skills in different sectors, you're stretched thin, and it's actually no surprise that people leave the country. So I'll give 3 examples just to illustrate the role of the state and the policies that were used. So for example, Nokia, which I guess many of you know that they started as a paper mill company, right, and a rubber company. So that tells you it's really that comparative advantage don't work, right? There's no reason for Finland in general, and Nokia in particular, to become a big player in telecommunication. However, the government actually played a key role. So if you look at the history of the development of Nokia, the phone, or the post and telecommunication operator played actually a key role. It's kind of the unsung hero of their success. They literally forced them to innovate in the 70s and 80s through their procurement policies, right? So they would order for example, the first digital phone switchboard. They started building the first wireless network. There was competition. There was, of course, innovation on the part of Nokia, especially in terms of management, but the public sector plays the huge role in actually pushing new technologies and diffusing them. The parallels with Taiwan province of China are actually striking. Both of them had very high level, if you want, committees or commissions that would drive this innovation effort. So you had these 2 councils in both countries that were basically chaired by the prime minister or deputy prime minister. That would involve different ministries, private sector, labor unions in Finland, for example, and so on and so forth. The equivalent of ITRI in Taiwan province of China was TEKES in Finland, who was kind of this umbrella agency that helped the companies in tech to grow, in particular Nokia. And they also had the equivalent of the Public Research Institute, which is VTT in Finland, that insisted basically on electronics and create the technology. Actually, a lot of Nokia's R&D was done in VTT, in this Public Research Institute. So when we looked at the data, what you can see, which is striking, is that in the 80s and 90s, where Nokia produced this very important effort in R&D to basically produce their mobile phones, 7 to 8% of their R&D was directly funded by the public sector. And this is the direct funding. It excludes partnerships, right? So that could be actually much higher. So after the 90s and up to 2000, basically Nokia's R&D started shooting up. And what we see in the data is that in the last years, Nokia's R&D represented pretty much 1% of the GDP of Nokia. In fact, if you compare Finland to Estonia, what you can see is that Nokia alone could explain the difference between the 2. So I'll go faster. So this is just to illustrate the role of university-centered innovation in Switzerland. So they have excellent production of science, but they have a very nice model to actually translate this science into companies. Again, the role of the state here is that they give grants to engineers and PhD students to work on their prototype for a year and then develop their SMEs. But still not as successful, and they have the same issues of companies actually going to the US or abroad to grow. Singapore is also a great example because they built this cluster in Biopharma, and they also did what we call this integrated approach, purpose-specific policies. So they thought about the research institutes, a lot of partnerships with industry. They thought about developing the skills. Biopolis is this kind of infrastructure to do research in pharma. So again, an excellent example of integrated policies, but it's really hard. They're still not as successful as Boston in terms of innovation in pharma. So to conclude, what you need is, of course, improve education quality, right? That things are known. So early childhood program could be one thing to look at, teacher quality, and so on and so forth. Changing social attitude in advanced economies, encouraging entrepreneurship could be important, right? You need to produce the Elon Musks and so on, right? To grow these firms. So I'll just conclude to say the key thing is basically exporting activities of domestic firms and local technology creation. As we saw with the example of Malaysia, FDI for multinational was not that successful in technology spillovers. Picking sectors rather than firms is very important. You don't want to sign blank checks. You want competition. If a firm fails, it's fine, but as long as the whole industry survives. You also have to insist on local technology. So the final point is invest in purpose-specific skills and infrastructure, and then change incentives for firms and workers. I'll finish with this quote from Albert Hirschman. Sorry, we don't have Zappa, but so basically the famous development economist who basically said that creativity always comes as a surprise, so you have to push people into these difficult tasks, difficult sectors, and you'll be surprised by how innovative they can be. Thanks. Oh, sure.
Thank you very much, Reda. Maybe stay on stage. Let's take a few questions from the audience. I have the first one myself.
Should we stay on stage?
Estonia is very dependent in its R&D and business support activities on EU structural funds. And currently, the EU is implementing this, what they call this Smart Specialization Initiative. I know you have met with the author of Smart Specialization last week, and I would like to hear what you would think about the relevance of Smart Specialization for Estonia. Is it a suitable strategy for Estonia? And if not, then what would be?
Yes, it's actually last week before we came, we were at EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland. So we talked to Dominique Faure, and actually he's about to go to Brussels to discuss his smart specialization strategy, and he's about to do his MOOC online course on this, so it could be interesting for people who are interested in this. Well, in general, I mean, our understanding, of course, I mean, we have to go deeper into what exactly is meant by smart specialization strategies, but our understanding is it's probably close to Hausmann's kind of economic complexity map, so where you have your certain strengths, you go to certain areas around your certain strengths, which could be fine. I mean, if you're an advanced country like, say, Netherlands, you have a lot of diversified sectors, sophisticated sectors, tradable goods. So going, around those sectors seems like a natural thing to do. But if you are, say, like Estonia or another middle-income country or kind of advanced country who just, crossed the threshold, still has catching up to do, may not have a lot of sophisticated exports or sectors, tradable goods, then the question is what exactly this country will do, because the sectors probably don't even exist. So what you're going to do then? And I guess that's an open question. So
yeah, just to add, maybe it doesn't prevent countries like Estonia from doing kind of both approach, because basically the idea of smart specialization, at least how we understood it, is that you build on your strengths, right? You have already existing firms, existing activities or industries, and then you build around them. I mean, most countries actually did that. Finland still produces a lot of, logging and so on and so forth. So nothing prevents from doing that, but you could also try to wander beyond your kind of comparative advantage, right? So maybe a kind of a mixed approach could work.
All right. Thank you very
idea.
much. Any questions from the audience? All right, there.
Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I was wondering during this that we are told that the world has entered the information age, the information era, and the trade in tangible goods will most probably decrease in the near future, and the trade in digital content will increase, and the global value chains are most probably to be contracted. So can it be, and of course there's a lot of talking about going from industry to services. So would it be possible to skip the stage of advanced manufacturing after all, and to go more deeply into services instead, and try to develop the R&D capabilities there, given these circumstances?
Actually, yeah. So yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we often give this example that, for example, automotive industry is becoming actually mostly software development, right, in cars, especially when we move to the self-driving cars. So it's correct. It's not really just producing the stuff. So that part is important. But I mean, I would say maybe it could still be important to produce things, but still, it's still an activity that is related to manufacturing, right? I guess when we talked about services, we're really thinking about the traditional services where there are not much productivity gains, right? Tourism, things like this. So you really want to think about services that connected to manufacturing. As we saw in the US data, services like software and scientific, consulting actually has a very high content in terms of R&D, extremely intense. So that's maybe the sectors you want to think about. Yeah.
I mean, I would just add a couple of things. It's true, it's about integration of manufacturing and services. But also, if you think about it, for smaller country like Estonia, it may work to some extent, because the issue is, would it generate enough jobs? Manufacturing usually does, although again, you can argue with robotization, it's not going to be as much. But then the question is, why not to produce robots themselves? No, because, I mean, eventually maybe robots will be producing robots, but we are not at that stage yet. So it's an open question. And then productivity gains, we usually see it mostly in manufacturing rather than services. Yeah. So that's also another issue.
Yeah. The other thing is that these things could come together, right? I mean, the example, we were in EPFL, we were reminded many times that the size of Switzerland is about 8-9 million, but they employ 3 million people abroad. Right? You could still do a lot of R&D and actually produce, in other countries. So maybe both could happen.
I think we have one more question.
Short one, I hope it's not too complicated. In the R&D community, there's always a tension between R and D. You've been talking a lot about patents. You've been talking very little about frontier research and top publications. Would you comment on this tension? Do you see a tension there, or do you see there is a policy issue, or is that a free market issue?
I would say it's very correlated, right? The Koreans, while they were increasing the number of patents, they were increasing the number of publications. These things go together. You can think about it two ways. Who's going to produce these ideas? Right? If you want to do real breakthroughs, you have to be really good in your field. Now, do you have to produce really basic science? I mean, it's a tough question, right, for a middle-income country, but at least from what we saw, there was a lot of basic science, it's true, but in the early stages, extremely applied, right? You have to be pragmatic. But when you reach the frontier, then you want to do basic science, because this is where you will create the new path. So not necessarily inconsistent.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, sometimes it seems to me that, well, when I go around in political circles, there is almost a consensus across parties that innovation is something that happens somewhere in the heads of scientists and businessmen, and the state has really nothing to do with this except for providing a nice business environment. And our previous speakers directed my attention to this fact that the iPhone that most of us use, most of the technologies in this phone have been developed with state support. The multi-touch screen, the lithium-ion battery, the microprocessor, the Siri, the internet, and so on. Even Google received a fair amount of state aid. Namely, the scientists who developed the search algorithm for Google received a 4.5 million grant from the National Science Foundation. We have someone here today who has worked for the last 10 years at the US National Science Foundation. He knows what it takes to get from an invention to an innovation and what kind of support structures are needed along the way.